I was at a crossroads in my life, a real crisis. I was a chemistry major in college, but I was miserable. And it was the summer between my junior and senior year, and I was staying at my parents' house on a river in the state of Missouri, where my mother is from. And that was when I read a book called Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse. And in this book, the protagonist finds focus and direction for his life. He may have even become enlightened. I'm still not quite sure what happened to him in the end of the book. But the way he achieved it, he ended up living on a river and speaking to the river and hearing its responses. Now, I always loved my river in Missouri, and I think deep down inside, I thought that this river could talk to me. And so, for the next several days, I sat and I stared at the river for hours, and I heard nothing. I felt I had to get closer. I needed to go to the source of the river. I needed to spend hours gliding along its surface, listening for the faintest whisper. I needed to spend nights sleeping on its banks. And that was when I phoned up a friend of the family and had him drive me way upriver to the source. And that was how I had my big night out. My big night out on the river. This friend of the family, he was always telling stories about the river, and this was no exception. As he was driving, he asked, "You heard of a catfish?" I said, "Yes." He said, "You heard of a dogfish?" I said, "No." And then he proceeded in telling me how he had trained a fish to go and fetch his lure and bring it back. He didn't even need a rod with line. He could throw the lure and it would go and bring it. I interrupted him and I said, "Rich," that's his name. "You know this river. You've lived on it all your life. Do you think you can talk to the river?" He gave me a look. And he said, "Sure do." And I said, "How do you know when it's talking to you? How do you know?" And he gave me a wink. And he said, "Brandon, you just know." What I hadn't expected was how small the river was going to be at the source. Gliding along, listening for the faintest whisper. Ha! I had a rope slung over my shoulder, dragging my canoe through what was essentially wet gravel. And every turn there'd be this log jam, and I'd have to unload the canoe, pitch it over the top, and reload it on the other side. And the worst thing was, the hottest part of the day, about 2 o'clock, I think my mind was beginning to play tricks on me. As I was trudging through the wet gravel, I began to hear footsteps behind me. One time I was so sure I heard someone walking behind me, I threw the rope down and I walked back upstream, hollering, "Hello? Is somebody there? I can hear you." Nobody. That night at my little campsite, I was exhausted. I was heartened by one thing. This big creek came in, doubling the size of the river, and so I was hoping that the next day I'd actually be able to paddle a little bit. I stared out of the water, that black, glassy surface reflecting the luminescence of the night sky. And for the first time that day, I did what I had come to do. I listened. What is it saying, this river? Crunch, splash, crunch, splash. This time I was not imagining it. Something was definitely walking downstream right into my campsite. And sure enough, in the ring of light from my campfire, an enormous shadow loomed. And a large man with the biggest goddamn hat I have ever seen in my life walked right into my campsite and sat opposite me at my fire. He knelt like this. His hat hid his eyes, but I remember seeing his bright red lips, which stretched across his chin in a smile, just like a river snake sunning itself on a rock. "The name's Wino," he said. And he didn't say much else, except for he came out into the woods from time to time to dry out. I gathered he was some kind of drinking man. Oh, but me, I began to bubble away nervously all about the book, Siddhartha, and how Siddhartha became enlightened with the river by talking to it. And I didn't want to be enlightened, but I wanted to talk to the river. And then I made a connection I'd never made before in my life. My grandmother used to pick me up at the airport and bring me to the house on the river. And she would always stop on the bridge and make me get out the first day I was there and say hello to the river. And then a few weeks later when I left, she'd make me stand there on the bridge, and with tears in my eyes, I would say, "Goodbye, river, goodbye." Well, Wino, abruptly, without any warning, just stood up and walked back out into the darkness. And I listened as those footsteps disappeared back upstream. I began to think, I probably sounded kind of strange. I might have even sounded a little crazy. Maybe I even drove him out of the campsite. And I resolved that the next morning, if he came by, I'd invite him into my campsite and I'd explain myself a little better. That was when I heard a snap and a crash, this time coming off the hill. Something big was moving down the hillside toward my campsite. I walked over to the edge of the gravel bar where it met the woods. "Hello, Wino?" I called hopefully. "Is that you? I'm glad you're coming back. I need to explain myself a little bit." This next sound made the hair on the back of my neck rise. The only way I can describe it, it's like a wolf howling through a garden hose. I backed up so close to the fire, I was in the fire. And in my hands, I suddenly had the axe, just as two glowing eyes appeared from those woods and began to bounce up and down about this high off the ground as whatever it is came charging at me. I brought the axe down on this thing, and it skidded through the gravel, and I saw hooves. It was a very angry, very small, wild pig, and I don't know what I had done to make it so angry, but it circled around and came at me again. I don't know how many times I brought the axe down on that thing, how many times it charged me, but it was clear one of us was going to die that night. And so I began to pitch everything from my campsite into the canoe, and I eventually just shoved off into the darkness, hitting every log and rock there was. And I'll be danged if that angry little pig didn't launch itself and just start snorkeling right after me. I paddled and paddled and paddled, and every time I thought I'd gone far enough, I'd pull over and I'd hear that angry squeal still echoing down the river valley. I don't know when it was. It was late, but I must have dozed off. And my canoe wedged on a rock on the bank. And something woke me up. With a start, I sat bolt upright, and a big leaf fell off my head. My cheek stung in the morning mist from where I'd been resting on a bolt on the bottom of the canoe. And I heard the knock of an oar. And out of the mist emerged a canoe, its passenger gliding effortlessly out in the swift current of the main channel. "Wino!" I cheered. And he looked back at me with those unseen eyes beneath his hat. "Last night I thought it was you, but it was a hog." And another leaf fell from my face. Wino's lips were twisted into that same smile over his chin, just like that river snake on that rock. And without saying a word, he disappeared into the mist. I had done nothing to reassure him that I wasn't mad as a hatter. And so I pulled over and made a cup of coffee, and I began to collect myself. And then I began to paddle. I think it became an unconscious goal for me to catch up to Wino and really explain myself. But every turn, nothing. I paddled and paddled all day, and I never saw him. I never saw him again. And late that afternoon, I was done. I went into a farmhouse and called up Rich and had him come pick me up. And of course, on the ride home, he looked at me and he said, "Well, did you hear the voice of the river?" "Oh," I moaned. "I was chased all night by a hog down the river." And he laughed and he laughed. It was the first time I think I'd ever told him a story about the river. And then he began to tell me how I must have been going right through this stretch of river that was considered to be haunted. There had been a serial killer who'd killed 73 people and stuffed every one of the bodies in these deep holes in the water. And I was about to tell him about Wino, but then I paused. We were driving across a bridge, and there was the river laid out beneath us, twinkling in the late afternoon light. And in that pause, I think that's when I heard its first whisper. That silence between two stories told by two people who know the river and who love the river. And I know Rich was hearing it too, because he looked over at me and he gave me that wink. It was the voice of the river. Well, the river didn't speak in words. It was a gentle but steady urging. Encouragement, really. Pure encouragement to never give up. And when I returned that fall to school, I didn't sign up for chemistry classes. I ended up majoring in English literature. And so, because of that big night out on the river, I ended up becoming a humanities teacher here at Sonoma Academy. And because of that big night out, I think it all led to this night with me telling you a story. Thank you.